Okay, we're looking at Acts 17. It's only 9 verses, so it can't be that long. We'll see. Next slide, please. So when Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. So from Philippi to Thessalonica is about it's about 105 miles. From where we are to San Francisco is about 88 miles. Anybody want to walk to San Francisco with me? I mean, that's a long time. I mean, just think of that. How many days would that take? 4 days? You got to really like the people you're walking with. Yeah, when Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. And some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here." And Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. When they heard this, the crowd and city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. So what did you notice? What do you see? That's all I have planned for this part of the sermon. So, don't notice anything? I'm sorry? Yeah, some will believe, some won't. Yeah? Anything else you notice? Yeah, guilt by association. Yeah, I think we've probably all been there sooner or later, once in a while. Next, anything else you notice? I'm sorry? Jealousy. Yeah, that's pretty clear. There was a Jewish synagogue. Yeah, there wasn't one. So by the time the events of the New Testament are taking place, something like 4/5 of all the Jews in the world lived outside of Palestine or ancient Israel. They had been deported systematically over the last 3 or 4 centuries by various empires, and so there are Jews all the way to present-day Morocco. There are Jews in present-day Iran and Iraq, way back then. Jews in present-day France and Germany. So all over the Roman world and even beyond it. And so there's some here. And there's enough that they formed a synagogue. You need 12, I think it was, to be able to form a synagogue. Anything else you notice? Okay, I think next slide, let's see. Yeah, so what happened at Philippi? Well, there was a riot. And Paul's Roman citizenship came into play. So just because you live within the boundary of the empire didn't make you a citizen. To be a citizen, technically, to be a Roman citizen is you're a citizen of the city of Rome. So the Roman Empire would be like if Modesto conquered all of North America and ran the whole thing through the Modesto City Council. And it took a long time. It took, but they started the conquest of Italy started in the 700s BC. So it took centuries, and so Roman citizenship, when Paul was alive, was pretty rare. In fact, you remember that folks are just surprised when it turns out that Paul is a Roman citizen. They can't understand that. So how would he become a Roman citizen? Well, it was passed down. So somebody in Paul's background, like his great-grandfather or something, had done something to benefit a Roman general or to benefit the empire, and they made him a citizen, and that was passed down. But it was so rare that nobody really expected that Paul would be a citizen. And so Philippi, there was a riot. Next slide. And they walked. Yeah, imagine that. The luxury. So before the Continental Congress, when the Continental Congress was meeting, John Adams, along with somebody he knew from his town, he lived in Braintree, Massachusetts. It's a bad name for a town, if you ask me. Braintree, Massachusetts. But it took them 12 days to get to the Continental Congress. 12 days. Just imagine the luxury of a conversation like that. I mean, think about how much time you've spent in deep conversation with even someone that's really close to you. Have you spent as much as 12 days over the past 12 years with them? Think about how hurried is the rhythm of our lives now, and how our connections are often with people we don't really know well at all. Maybe we've never even been in the same physical location with them. Next slide. Yeah, how well do we know one another? And how as a culture can we feel so lonely? Right? I mean, that's what all the sociologists say, is that our age in this country is, people report higher levels, if that's the right way to put it, higher levels of loneliness than ever before. And we're so uber connected. I have students who are, their best friends are people they've never been physically in the same spot with. Loneliness. Next slide. And there was a Jewish synagogue. So, as I've said, there was a Jewish diaspora. Now, I ought to say a little bit about ancient religion. You remember, I'm sure, from school, the Olympian gods, Zeus and Apollo and all that kind of stuff. Well, they are, in essence, giant 13-year-olds who have awesome power, but they aren't very responsible. They're not moral exemplars. And so nobody, while they had belief in these gods, it wasn't the same kind of belief in God that we Christians have or that Jews have, a trust in their God. They were more just the parts of the world that we can't control. So they didn't have what we would call faith in their gods. They didn't look to their gods as moral examples. They didn't look to their gods to save them from anything or to save them for anything. And so the only analog to it, the kind of faith we understand as Christians in present day, or for the last 1,700, 1,800 years, the only analog was Judaism itself, which was also mysterious to the Romans. When about 180 AD, after Christianity had become pretty well established in the Roman Empire, still illegal, we have the records of a court case in North Africa where a Roman judge is asking these Christians about their faith, and the Christians are expressing that this is unique, it's unlike what the Romans believe, and the Roman judge clearly doesn't understand what they're talking about. He said, "We too are a religious people." But it didn't mean for them what it means to Christians or to our Jewish brothers. A faith in someone. A faith in someone who's been alive, who is still alive, who loves us and cares for us, So pagan religion was simply a series of cult acts. If you were going to worship, that'd be like if you were worshiping some Roman god, what would that be? Well, it'd probably take about a minute and a half. If you've done something, if something horrible has happened to you, then you've done something to upset some god. Just figure out which one it is. Go to the shrine and spend a minute, maybe two, and offer a little wine. Just pour out a little wine and a little prayer, and boom, you're good. So faith was inconceivable. They just had no idea what that was like. So pagan religion, not faith, really. Next slide. This was his custom. Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. Next slide. This would have been pretty typical. It was his usual strategy. Paul was a strategic thinker. At one point he says, what do you think? You think I box aimlessly? He's got a plan. And his plan, he works it everywhere he goes. Goes to a Jewish synagogue where there's people that at least recognize the structure of the faith he's talking about. And he's a guest. He's invited to speak. So perhaps he was known, maybe not, but it was untypical that someone of his stature would be showing up in town. Next slide. Explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead is what he said. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. So God-fearers, these were non-Jews who clearly understood that there was no moral sense to paganism, and they had a desire for some kind of moral rooting. And so we know that there were thousands and thousands of non-Jews who were attracted to Judaism and who became a part of a synagogue, but they had not converted fully. In fact, there are remains of some of the ancient amphitheaters. There are actually carved in some of the stone seats, or like where the aisle would be going up from the stairs going up and down. Carved into the stone is God-fearers here, like first-class seating. That's interesting. And prominent women. Judaism and Christianity, maybe more than any other social construct in the Roman world, valued women. Treated them as fully human and granted them respect. Next slide. This Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. So, do you remember on Palm Sunday when Jesus is going into Jerusalem and they put palm branches in front of him? And they say, hail the king. Well, so 200 years before, 300 years before, a guy named Judas Maccabee, this is the Maccabean Rebellion, started a guerrilla warfare against those who had conquered the Jews. And he was the oldest son. No, it wasn't the oldest son, but one of 5 sons. And the name Maccabee, that wasn't his last name, but that's a nickname they gave him. Maccabee means the hammerer. That's like a Worldwide Wrestling Federation name. Judas the Destroyer or something. Because he led a rebellion, a successful rebellion against then the most powerful empire on earth, the Seleucid Empire, the successor state of Alexander the Great. And when they had kicked out these interlopers, and they entered Jerusalem for the festival to celebrate their victory, the crowd put in front of him palm branches. So what the crowd is doing when Jesus walks up that same road is they're saying to him, you kicked the Romans out. The same way Judas Maccabee kicked out the Greeks. So that's their idea of Messiah. Someone is going to take care of business. Someone is going to to return to us our rightful place. And Jesus, of course, doesn't do that. Jesus is crucified by the Romans. So it's a remarkable disconnect between their expectation, their desire of what a Messiah would do, and what he actually does. So Paul has got to explain to them how he actually is the Messiah. And he does it by conjuring this phrase, Son of Man, which is Jesus' favorite self-designation. He never calls himself Messiah. He knows he is. But over and over again, 82 times in the Gospels, he calls himself Son of Man. Now, that comes from, on the one hand, Daniel 7. Daniel 7 is like the Bible version of the movie Jaws. Right, how that starts out? It's night, right? Bad things happen at night. Freddy Krueger attacks at night, doesn't attack at noon in the grocery, in the fruit, in the vegetable aisle of Rayleigh's. And then, so the Jaws opens up, it's night, and there's that music, right? So that's going, and then suddenly there's this sudden movement. So Daniel 7 opens up, it's night, and there's a storm. And out of the storm come beasts. That's the Bible's way of saying triple bad. Night, bad things happen at night. A storm, the sea is disturbed, right? Jonah goes out over the sea because he thinks, boy, if there's any place on earth that God doesn't have power, it's the sea. And there's a storm, and he figures, okay, God's got power here too. So it's storm, night, storm, and out of the sea come beasts, and beasts represent political power or social power, just the institutional power. And the beasts are told to arise and devour much flesh. That's what happens, right? Been to the DMV lately? That was cheap. I shouldn't have said that. But I mean, but our experience of organized whatever is that we can be treated less than human. And so those beasts, they consume flesh and body parts go flying out of their mouths. Felt like that? But a voice from heaven, God says, I've had enough. And he sends one like a son of man. That's why Jesus' favorite self-designation is Son of Man. It sends one like a son of man, and that son of man defeats the beast and creates a calm sea. And all peoples and nations will serve the Son of Man. But Jesus says, I'm the Son of Man, but I have come not to be served, but to serve and to give. That comes from Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. Nobody had ever put those two together before. So that's unique. That starts with Jesus. Is that making sense? So, next slide. That's how Paul needs to explain how Jesus is God's Messiah, and he did it by being the suffering servant. God's design isn't to create another human kingdom here, it's to create a different kind of kingdom. A kingdom of our hearts. So the non-faith, non-morality of paganism, and the faith and the moral culture of Christianity. Next slide. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. That sounds pretty horrifying, to bring him out to the crowd. Yeah, they're hoping for a mob action. Next slide. So as I said, Roman Thessalonica was a free city. What does that mean? Well, it meant they had a lot of control, free of the Roman state. They were trusted. If there's a riot there, that's going to be threatened. They're going to say, we need more police presence. Not just the police, we need the National Guard. We need the military. So that was the danger. So the city officials want to keep things calm. Next slide. But they didn't find him. They dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, these men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here. Next slide. And Jason has welcomed them into his house. They're all defying Caesar's decrees. That's dangerous, defying Caesar's decrees. Saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. Yeah, so there's only one king, ultimate power, that's Caesar. Now, this early in the empire, the emperors didn't really need to advertise their power because there was no other competitor. So Augustus Caesar, for instance, was very slow to allow people to even refer to him as God. People all the time were trying to call him God and wanted to build temples in his name, and he actually denied the request over and over and over again because he already had all the power. But this would have been a unique threat. So it's a pretty serious issue. Next slide. So yeah, trouble all over the world. Another king. So that could threaten the city leaders because they've got to keep things peaceful. Next slide. When they heard this, the crowd and city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. So the state let them go. The state doesn't understand the nature of the gospel. Political officials don't understand the nature of the gospel. They can recognize its benefit and maybe at times even try to be friendly, but recognizing the nature of the gospel. The state has a hard time doing that. Next slide. So conclusions. Isn't that good? We're at the conclusions part. When I was a kid, I was always really happy when we got to that part of the sermon. Next slide. So, Son of Man. Next slide. So yeah, Daniel 7, Isaiah 53, we talked about that. That combination, that's a unique theology, originates with Jesus. And that also tells us that we see what we want to see. Ever notice that? We see what we want to see. We don't often see what's really right in front of us. So the world doesn't understand meekness. Meekness isn't weakness. It's choosing the path of listening, of watching, of empathy. So what is required to see God at work? Next slide. Well, the second conclusion is the world doesn't understand. We often don't understand the nature of us, the nature of the Christian life. Next slide. So the nature of the gospel includes and is driven by meekness, not asserting yourself, listening more than talking, and suffering. I'll bet you're happy to hear that word, suffering. When we suffer, we are either broken or we're broken open. When we're broken, we lash out and we get smaller. We refuse to recognize we might have had some part of the suffering that has come upon us. But when we're broken open, we're able to ask, what can I learn about me? What can I learn about the world around me? What can I learn about those near me who themselves are hurting, who themselves have a backstory that I don't fully understand? But maybe I need to, maybe I'd like to. Aeschylus, the greatest of the Greek playwrights, 500 years before Jesus, wrote this at the beginning of his The Agamemnon, one of his great plays. It's the will of the gods that those who learn wisdom must suffer. And even in our sleep, pain we cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until with it, unbidden and against our will, comes wisdom by the awful grace of God. Now he said, turn away from self. Self-absorption, you end up ruining the lives of everybody around you and your own life. That's the way to drive the car off the cliff right away. That's the way to become a person that no one wants to be around. You ruin everything you touch. Curiously, suffering is the route to wisdom. So he said, turn away from selfishness, and suffering helps us do that. But he had no answer. Turn to what? But the gospel says, we are made for God, and we have lost our way. And we see Jesus and his sacrifice as weak. We see Jesus and his sacrifice as not very appealing. It's hard to build an empire of me that way. But it is the path to our healing and to our best and to the good of those around us. So Aeschylus in all his wisdom said, turn from selfishness. You just ruin your life and everyone else's that way. And the gospel says, turn to faith. This is what we were made for. So Augustine died in 430, one of the four greatest thinkers in the Christian tradition. He wrote City of God, which is not city like Stockton, but population, community. And he said the whole world we live in is there's three cities. There's the city of Satan, those loyal to Satan, the city of God, those loyal to God, and there's this city, that city we live in, which is the city of confusion, where those loyal to God and those loyal to self and Satan intermingle all the time. And we're constantly influencing each other, one way or the other. And he said, this world can never be the city of God, because there's way too many temptations for the less than savory part of the human character to come out. It's a foolish enterprise. And in fact, history would say, if there are 90 times that people have tried to make a country Christian, you know what the score is? No wins, 90 losses. It just can't happen. But what Augustine says is, what we ought to do is seek to be God's representatives in this land. And that's what Paul's trying to do. He's trying to say, those of you who are alert and aware to the part of you that resonates with the God who made you, that wants to be good, that wants to grow, that understands we need each other. This is the way. Next slide. And third conclusion, the gospel makes sense to our true selves. People at the end of their life frequently say, I wish I'd been more kind. I wish I'd been more loving. How many people say, oh my God, I wish I'd spent more time at work? We want to love. We want to be kind. We want to be true. We want to connect. How can we get to those four ends? We get to them by recognizing we're broken and we need help from outside. And the gospel promised that the Lord Jesus Christ, who sacrificed himself for us, that if we align ourselves, if we ask the Spirit to come in, we can be on that path to the upward call of God in Christ Jesus and be connected where all these things can come true. So, how about it? Let's recommit to opening our hearts to the Lord who loves us and gave himself up for us. Let's turn our backs on the way of the world, even though it's attractive to the less noble parts of us. But let's recognize that and turn our backs from that and walk into the light. I'd like you to look around the room right now. Look other people in the eye, please. This is my only assignment. These are your brothers and sisters. And there are lots more out there who are lost. Let's be God's representatives to the world which needs saving and doesn't even know it. Amen?